These are the gunmen the world knows as the Janjaweed, accused of mass rape and murder in Darfur. Until now, their bases have never been seen by the outside world. We traveled hundreds of miles through hostile territory to meet them. The United Nations wants their senior commander investigated for war crimes. This is Commander Mohammed Hamdan. The Sudanese government claims it doesn't back the Janjaweed, but these fighters told me the government gave them their weapons. Many were made in China. You can see here that the mortars actually have Chinese symbols on them. They're Chinese made. We'd arrived as they considered a decision that could affect the whole Darfur conflict, whether to turn their guns on the government. I said, will you fight them? And he said, we will fight them till Judgment Day. Darfur is a part of Sudan that its government doesn't want people to visit. We'd chartered a plane to get there. We're just crossing the border into Darfur from the south of Sudan. The only access point that the Sudanese government in Khartoum doesn't have control over. No one knows how many hundreds of thousands have died in Darfur during 5 years of war. Sudan's people are a mix of Arabs and Africans, but it's those of Arab descent who hold most power. The killing began when Darfur's Africans rebelled, demanding a greater say in government. Arab fighters, the Janjaweed, took up arms against the rebels and drove millions from their homes. I'd heard there was a chance some of the Janjaweed would meet us. Our pilots planned to land in a clearing in the scrub. If I'm honest, I would have to admit that I'm really, really worried. We have absolutely no way of knowing whether this strip of land is usable for landing. My contacts were local Arabs who'd agreed to take us to a key Janjaweed base. It meant a 300-mile drive across southern Darfur. Our guides carried weapons because of the war and because of bandits. We soon saw the first consequences of the conflict. We're just coming up to the first displaced people's camp that we've encountered so far on our journey west. I think these are the images that people really associate with Darfur. A tribal leader wanted to show me around the camp. It opened just 4 months ago. This is the only water tank for this entire camp for 8,000 people. This camp is... They're telling us that this camp is actually full to capacity. So when they did the last count on the 24th of December, it was at 8,000, but they've had to keep taking people in, even though there's nowhere to put them. It's just incredible to me that 5 years on from the beginning of this conflict, that there is still the capacity for new camps, that people are still being forced out of their homes. This is Fatma. She just fled with her family from their home 40 miles away. She said one afternoon men rode into their village shooting. They killed 8 people, and those who could ran away. What was your life like before the trouble started? She says their life used to be so good. They lived in brick houses. She said they had donkeys and livestock, and she said we had a means of living, and now we're here under borrowed matting, waiting for handouts. This was the second time she'd been forced to flee her home. She said that there are only so many times that you can gather up the hope to start again. And this time she said, this is the last time they want to die here, if they can't go home. Who do you think is responsible for this? She didn't want to say in the beginning, but in the end she said that it was Arabs, that they came together and rode into their town and stole their livestock and burnt the village. These stories of Janjaweed attacks have been repeated for 5 years. The United Nations accuses the Sudanese government of being behind the Janjaweed and of helping organize the violence. The government denies this. One reason I wanted to meet the Janjaweed was to find out if the government was telling the truth. We've been traveling all day and we're still not even at the halfway point where we're going to spend the night. And now we've got a flat tire. That's our armed guard. He'd initially started digging with all the bullets in the cartridge in the gun. And then halfway through it was pointed out to him that that perhaps wasn't such a good idea. We were just outside of the Janjaweed commander's territory. The Janjaweed don't usually talk to journalists, but I'd heard this commander and his 20,000 men had fallen out with the Sudanese government and might be willing to talk. Over a satellite phone, they gave me a rendezvous point. We're just about to meet our escort car sent by the former Janjaweed commander. الحمد لله السلام عليكم ازيكم ان شاء الله طيبين الحمد لله كويسين الحمد لله تعبناكم معنا ما تكونوا استنيتونا كثير. This is the commander who's been sent to meet us. He told me that they'd fought against the rebels on the Sudanese government's behalf for 5 years but received little in return, so their leader had decided to lift the lid on their relationship. Their territory covers most of southern Darfur. They had held it for the government, pushing back the rebels, but now they'd fallen out with the government. Already there had been clashes. They showed us the route to the garrison. Our escort says that this route is safe and that we won't be meeting any trouble, and they should know, because if we'd been traveling this route a few months ago, they were the trouble. We'd been driving for 2 days. They said the garrison was another 2 days north. Our escort was heavily armed for the journey. The machine guns got amulets with verses from the Quran, blessed by a local sheikh, and all of them are wearing them. What do these protect you from? They stop bullets. Said even if a spear comes right in, it won't pierce you. The Sudanese government has denied arming the Janjaweed, but these fighters said that wasn't true. They told me to look at where their weapons had come from. You can see on this box, just across here, it says Yarmouk Industrial Complex, which is the main government industrial armament complex, which is under US economic sanctions for involvement in the manufacture and shipping of arms to Darfur. One of the officers, Jafna al-Bakhit, says he was recruited by the government. So how are you recruited? يعني لما جو جندوكم جندت كيف انت؟ He says at the start of the conflict, government recruiters went around Arab neighborhoods, promising rewards for those who took up arms against the rebels. There was a rush to join. But he says these rewards, being looked after by the government and investment in Arab villages, never came. We were approaching a government stronghold. The men were worried government sympathizers might alert the army to our presence. Our escort have asked that my director be brought into the back seat next to me, and they've tried as best as they can to conceal the fact that he's white by wrapping him in one of their scarves. They stopped briefly to show us the aftermath of a recent clash with the Sudanese army. This is 20 kilometers from Yala, from the government stronghold in South Darfur. They told us the government sent in planes to bomb them in revenge for their defection. He said his brother was killed here under the bombardment. He said that this is where someone else was killed. This is where the blood was. We didn't stay long. There's a Sudanese government helicopter that's been circling overhead. But once we're out of the circumference of Nyala, then we're hoping it'll be okay. Finally, they told us we were approaching the garrison. The garrison is just there. At first, all we could see were trees. Then we realized we were in a vast concealed camp. This is not what I expected at all. There are people sleeping under trees. There are people cooking and out in the open. It's not a conventional military garrison. They said 1,000 of their 20,000 men were based here. We've been told that the reason they chose this garrison is that unusually for this part of Darfur, there's a lot of tree cover, so that when government aeroplanes fly overhead, the troops can move under the trees. They were keen to show us their heavy weaponry. So this is the remote, and then the numbers on the remote correspond with the numbers of the tubes for the mortar. You can see here that the mortars actually have Chinese symbols on them. They're Chinese made. The Chinese government has been accused of flouting a UN arms embargo that bars the supply of weapons to groups involved in the Darfur conflict. China denies this. More Chinese letters and other Chinese made. Dasini? Yeah, they say it's a Chinese gun. This is a Sudanese armed forces truck with what looks like an anti-aircraft gun on the back of it. He's going to jump up and show us how it works. Were you operating this when it was a Sudanese government gun? Well, he himself used it in battle against the rebels in North Darfur. But he said that he's now used this government gun against the government themselves, bringing down 3 government planes in their initial clashes with the government after they first defected. The Sudanese government has denied arming the Janjaweed, but the men say they received weapons up until last October. We were told to wait at the edge of the garrison for the force's leader, Commander Mohammed Hamdan. But then we got word that he was having second thoughts about our filming. We've just seen Commander Hamdan's car cross the riverbed. We heard the government had started negotiating to bring the commander back on side. A delicate time, and not a good moment to go on the record about government backing for his forces. Incredibly, he still turned up. Alaikum assalam. Commander, ازيك كيفك انت؟ الله يسلمك ان شاء الله انت طيب. This is Commander Mohammed Hamdan, the man we spent the last 2 weeks trying to meet. Hamdan's men are accused of carrying out atrocities while allied to the government. Yet publicly, the powers in Khartoum have disowned them. He said he wanted to put the record straight. He said that in fact the government recruited him personally to fight against the Darfuri rebels in 2003 and made his men part of the armed forces. If we wanted proof, he said we should look around at his men's weapons. And he said to me, does it seem logical to you that we magicked these weapons in these brand new cars out of air? Of course the government gave them to us. He says his orders came straight from the top. Commander Hamdan said that he met the President of Sudan, President Umar al-Bashir, in his home in September of 2006, where he personally asked him to carry out campaigns in Sidr and Kariari in northern Darfur that had recently been taken by the Darfuri rebels. These are the first direct allegations by a senior Janjaweed leader that his force was armed and controlled by the Sudanese government. It's what the international community has long suspected. Next morning, I wanted to ask the commander about the crimes committed against civilians by Janjaweed and why the UN want him investigated for alleged war crimes. When the world thinks of Darfur and they think of the Arab tribes in Darfur, they think of the rapes and the looting and the pillages. Are your men responsible for that? Hamdan said he wasn't responsible for what others had done. His men had only fought insurgents. And when the government ordered him to carry out operations in civilian areas, he refused. And he says that he is willing to put his hand on his heart and say that he is responsible for his men and he knows what his men did and didn't do, and they didn't commit atrocities. He knows the world thinks his men are Janjaweed, but in his culture, a Janjaweed is a bandit who rapes and loots. His men were part of an organized force. Therefore, to call them Janjaweed is wrong. The men then produced what they said were army ID cards. You can see in Arabic it says identity for officers and soldiers, armed forces, commission for intelligence and security, and there's actually an ID number. They said all the men had cards like these, proving they were part of the government's forces. Hamdan said he'd welcome an investigation into his men's conduct. Hamdan wanted to show us that African villagers were still living close to the garrison, to reassure us that his men weren't murderers. After all, Janjaweed have burnt non-Arab settlements all across Darfur. They're just taking us to a nearby fort village because I think show evidence of conciliation between Arab and non-Arab tribes. Commander Hamdan's talking to some of the village elders by the look of it. This is Ishaq Abdurrahman, he's the tribal sheikh here. The sheikh said Arab bandits had attacked the village early in the conflict, but that Hamdan's forces stepped in to protect them. So would you describe him as a friend? The sheikh says, when I say that he's my neighbor, I mean that he's my brother. If the sheikh's sentiment was genuine, this scene doesn't fit with the accepted story of Darfur. Arabs and Africans seemingly living peacefully together. At the garrison, we saw something else totally unexpected. This is a new intake. These soldiers came in after the group defected from the government. What's interesting is that this force is not all Arab. There are both Arab Darfuris and non-Arab Darfuris who previously were on very opposing sides of the fence, and they signed up to be a rebellion against the Sudanese government together. Hamdan has already signed treaties with some African Darfuri rebel groups, his former enemies. He knows this will cause the government deep anxiety. There's no love for the Sudanese government here. The men say it stopped their salaries once it no longer needed them. And despite its promises, their villages remain deeply poor. This is Hamid Ibrahim. He's one of the oldest fighters in the force. He said he joined up to fight for his people, the Arabs, but he felt the government used him and then betrayed him. It slowly dawned on him, as he put it, that he was sleeping under the trees and the government was sleeping in air-conditioned buildings in Khartoum. And eventually he realized that he needed to defend himself against the government. When we asked the Sudanese government to respond to this program, they blamed the Darfur crisis on the rebel groups. They didn't deny mobilizing civilians into militia in response, but they say these are different from the Janjaweed, who they deny backing. At the end of our second day in the base, we heard that a tribal gathering, including Commander Hamdan's brother, wanted to speak to us. They hear all these words about them on the radio, in the international media, and they came here today because they wanted to ask us as journalists to explain to them whether there was a chance that not all of them could be seen as devils on horseback. He told us they feel marginalized, exploited by a government that has failed their community and made them its scapegoats for the civilian toll of the conflict. He says he has a message to the international community that they have never heard the Darfuri Arabs' side of the story. He says we're the first journalists to reach them, and it's 5 years into the conflict. Next morning, we discovered the government had made an offer designed to bring the movement back into the fold. Things were tense at the camp. Commander Hamdan is in a meeting with his senior field commanders. They might not look like much, sat cross-legged at the bottom of a dried riverbed, but what you're looking at back there is the senior command of the most potent fighting force in the Darfur conflict. The commander told us the government was offering cash to help develop Arab villages and a share in power. And the leadership knew the government had been trying to persuade their commanders in the field to switch sides. Events began to move quickly. We've been told by the commander's chief of staff that a deal between them and the government is not going to go ahead by the looks of things. People have been gathering at our camp all morning to feed us different snippets of information. It became very clear that these guys were thinking that clashes with the government is very likely. The leaders called a meeting of their top men. At stake, whether the biggest fighting force in Darfur would rejoin the government or become its enemy. All of the force commanders have been gathered here. There's a really consultative process in Arab tribes here. And even though Commander Hamdan might be the overall commander, he has to make sure that he's consulted his men and his men are on board before he can go forward with any decision he makes. The officer who's standing there now is putting forward the case for going back to war with the government. He's saying, I look around at you, the blossom of manhood, and I know that we are not here for fun. We are here because we have grievances, we have genuine grievances. It was clear the men felt the government still needed to do more to regain their trust. It's incredible to be at this gathering, to be at a gathering of people who have never been before seen by the world's media, but to be at one of the most important meetings. Commander Hamdan now knew his men were solidly behind him. He wants you to film this. His message to the government: give me what I want or face the consequences. The commander is saying this is the second time that they haven't delivered. And within the next 24 to 72 hours, we are going to make clear to the world what our position from them is. And he said we will fight them till Judgment Day. A few days later, the government gave them what they wanted. Without their Arab allies, the Sudanese government might be forced to give way in Darfur. The Janjaweed know they control the balance of power here, and they're going to exploit it.